This program is proudly brought to you by Telecom Limited and Daytech.
Good night, Papua New Guinea. I'm Malcolm Wyra, and welcome to another episode of InFocus. This year will mark 50 years of Papua New Guinea as a sovereign state. Throughout this time, PNG has forged relations with many countries around the world, as well as with major multilateral institutions like the United Nations. Given the emerging geopolitical tensions in the region and the world, PNG's foreign relations has been placed in the spotlight. Joining us to discuss this is Mr. Patrick Kaiku, Lecturer of Political Science at the University of Papua New Guinea. Patrick, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Wyra, and thank you, audience members.
Now, Patrick, I would like to get your thoughts on how PNG's foreign relations, how it has evolved since independence, especially with our foreign policy stance of friends to all, enemy to none. Is this foreign policy framework still relevant and applicable in the current context?
In the current context of the US-China rivalry in the region, and especially in Papua New Guinea's engagement with these two major powers, there are specific or certain aspects of the friend to all, enemy to none foreign policy posture that are useful and applicable in this context. We simplify friend to all, enemy to none as universalism. Universalism is basically about being neutral and taking no sides in any geopolitical tension or misunderstanding between great powers. So the friend to all, enemy to none, or universalism, was used in 1975, was the first foreign policy pronouncement of the newly independent Papua New Guinea. We actually committed not to be part of the communist bloc or the US-led Western powers during the Cold War situation. And in the current context also of the US-China relationship, it is usually made mention of, especially when we are trying to strike a balance between our relationship with the US-led alliances and the Chinese. So it's a middle ground taking neutrality. Papua New Guinea is also a member of the non-aligned movement. In 1993, it became a member of non-aligned movement. It's an organization that actually tries to take no sides in any, global confrontations or conflicts with major powers. You'll understand that the role of non-alignment and friend to all, enemy to none. One of the express forms of it is that PNG should not allow its territory to be militarized. When we allow our territory to be used as a staging ground for conduct of warfare against other parties in the region, we are a natural target. PNG is a very small state. We do not have the luxury of military and economic power to influence other states, and therefore the de facto foreign policy stance that we make is enemy to none, friend to all. It's a way of preserving our independence and our sovereignty, because as we learned from the Second World War, if we get entangled with major power confrontations, it may be to our detriment. We may not protect our territorial integrity and our national security. So that's why basically it's used in that context.
Currently, why is Papua New Guinea attracting a lot of geopolitical attention?
It's both a question of historical factors as well as geostrategic factors. So if you think about the Pacific and Papua New Guinea, traditionally we were, in contact with Western European powers. European powers had a specific historical footprint in the Pacific much earlier than other civilizations. So in the 1600s, 1700s, the Pacific was discovered by Europeans, and ever since they've established their, influence in the Pacific and in Papua New Guinea. And therefore, when you see the rise of other powers, non-Western powers like China, for example, it is now trying to displace these already existing traditional powers that are, in operation in the Pacific, and who have established relationship and security alliances and, all forms of diplomatic relationship with the Pacific. So we are just seeing how the influence of non-Western powers like China is trying to dislodge the influence and the interest of other existing powers, traditional powers who have been existing in this country and in the region. The second part, of course, is the geostrategic importance of PNG. You know, Papua New Guinea geographically is positioned between Australasia, the Pacific, and Southeast Asia. It is a land bridge between these three different parts of the Asia Pacific. So it's a buffer zone traditionally or historically against, invasion perhaps from, and we saw that in the Second World War. So it's always in the interest of the Americans and the Australians that they will always have to have an influence in Papua New Guinea, because it's a buffer zone for them to protect their own interests. So Papua New Guinea is naturally caught up in this, geopolitical, diplomatic maneuverings.
Now, given the geopolitical tussle within the region, is this an opportunity for Papua New Guinea to utilize the competing interests to get more investments in the country, or do you foresee a potential threat down the line?
When we talk about geopolitical tussle within the region, I think the average Papua New Guinean would not necessarily, care about, the geopolitical rivalry. I guess most Papua New Guineans may not understand what the geopolitical rivalry is all about. The average Papua New Guinean would be much more concerned about the domestic developmental challenges of this country. And I guess that is where Papua New Guinea should position itself. In this geopolitical rivalry, it should be about the national interest of PNG, whether our domestic priorities in terms of healthcare, educational standards, infrastructure development. These are all developmental challenges that Papua New Guinea wants to engage with partners for its own benefit. We want to see, and it's appropriate that we're talking about this because the Eminent Peasants Group recently submitted a draft of the Foreign Policy White Paper. It's hopefully going to align the domestic needs of Papua New Guinea with our international relations, so that we see that, we are taking our international relations as a resource for us to develop our own development priorities. The US and China may have their own, rivalry. They may have their rivalry, but we should be ultimately putting the national interest of PNG, our own developmental prospects, in the front line in this particular situation, current context.
Thank you, Patrick. We now go for a quick break. Join us on the other side for more discussions. Welcome back. You're watching InFocus. Now, Patrick, does PNG have the balance right in terms of maintaining and strengthening its ties with traditional security partners like Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, and at the same time developing its economic and business relationships with countries like China? Where do you feel this can be further improved?
Papua New Guinea is an interesting balance because it was colonized by Western powers, and some of the countries that our traditional security partners, like Australia, for example, they share certain liberal democratic values that we share. I mean, we practice, or we aspire to practice. We have certain common policing culture. There are areas in the security aspect of our relationship that can naturally be part of our cooperation with these countries. So when you look at how Papua New Guinea wants to deal with its security challenges, it's always Australia, the first point of contact in terms of its seeking assistance. This is because China does not necessarily have the same kind of political ideas and values that Papua New Guinea share. So we naturally gravitate towards the Western powers in terms of our security cooperation, areas of security. In terms of economy, Papua New Guinea is increasingly looking at engaging with China. And of course, China is a large market with 1.4 billion people. Papua New Guinea is now increasingly looking. In April last year, when the Foreign Affairs Minister of China came to PNG, there were 6 MOUs that were signed, and Papua New Guinea now can export its agricultural products into China because of the large market that's available. These are perhaps areas of comparative advantage for PNG. We can pick and choose which aspect of our development and which development partners are relevant to those aspects of our development. There are also areas that can be improved. Australia is very close in terms of our geographical proximity. And of course, you may have heard from some of our political leaders who were really critical of how Australia does not necessarily allow us to export our agricultural commodities into the economy. And therefore, it's a challenge for us in PNG and our relationship with Australia. If we are going to try to deal with our relationship and especially development, is it possible for us to upgrade the level of exporting of our commodities, especially agriculture? Because Australia has always been strict about non-tariff barriers. You know, they put so much stress on phytosanitary and biosecurity, standards for their, imports. So it's something that PNG and Australia should work on, especially if Australia wants to maintain a good relationship with Papua New Guinea and deal with domestic challenges of PNG, such as poverty, alleviation, and all these other challenges.
I mean, there's a significant number of infrastructure projects like ports, airports, and telecommunications infrastructure that are being built in the region through Chinese government loans and financing. From your perspective, are you concerned about the potential usage of these facilities for military purposes?
The challenge of Papua New Guinea is to make sure that we are doing our own due diligence, and any negotiations about infrastructure projects that are going to be implemented by the Chinese are going to follow Papua New Guinean standards. So I think it goes back to how we negotiate some of these infrastructure projects and the Papua New Guinean input into that. And there are, of course, valid suspicions about the Chinese when it comes to the dual use of infrastructure. There is this 2017 PRC National Intelligence Law passed by the Parliament of China that compels Chinese nationals and state-owned enterprises to divulge and to cooperate with Chinese authorities about intelligence that may be collected in various countries that they are located in. So there's a lot of communication that Papua New Guinea has to do with the Chinese to try to get them to, align the projects that they conduct and infrastructure development to fit Papua New Guinean standards and to allay some of the suspicions about the potential dual use of infrastructure. Last point about this is, if you can recall from the 2022, the EU Special Economic Zone in the Gulf Province, this was earmarked as one of those Chinese-led infrastructure projects, and there were suspicions that it would cater for naval visits by the Chinese Navy. Now, this is perhaps exaggerated, but there are different ways of communicating and also allaying fears. So the Chinese and the Papua New Guinean officials have to really, allay fears, because most of what is the suspicions are happening are mostly propaganda that is driven by Western media outlets. They may exaggerate, and it's very, very dangerous if we are going to instigate potential miscommunication that may lead to, being suspicious of each other.
Similar arrangements have been categorized as debt trap diplomacy. Are these allegations well-founded?
There is a serious body of work that has been done by research think tanks in Australia, the Law Institute, for example, and they have debunked this particular accusation of debt trap diplomacy. Most of the debt that is incurred by Papua New Guinea is domestic debt. The Pacific Island countries with the most debt owed to China is in fact Tonga, and it's mostly infrastructure, and so there's not really any grounds to say that the debt trap is actually something real. It's mostly exaggerated in most instances, based on experiences of other Chinese projects in other parts of the world, like in Sri Lanka and in the Horn of Africa, for example.
Now, Patrick, we've recently seen PNG's successful bid to join the NRL in 2028. This venture will be largely funded by the Australian government. This arrangement is perceived as a form of soft power diplomacy through sports, namely the sport of rugby league. Is this a sustainable approach in strengthening ties between both countries?
Papua New Guinea and Australia, they share common values and common historical relationships. And then, of course, the hobby of the pastime of rugby league. The sustainability of this particular program may boil down to what kinds of domestic developmental priorities of Papua New Guinea are going to be facilitated through this particular arrangement. Are we going to deal with the youth development issues, with the health issues? Is NRL going to deal with the employment situation in the country? So it's, I think, sustainable in the context of understanding how it enhances or it promotes Papua New Guinea's priorities in terms of development. And of course, we may want to also think that it can be a cultural factor in linking the two countries. So it could be sustainable if it is used in the context of being a medium through which continuous dialogue between Papua New Guinea and Australia is enhanced. So that's where soft power is. Soft power is about dialogue, it's about authentic, credible relationships that are built through mutual respect for each other's. So if Rugby League does that, and if Papua New Guinea's participation in NRL is part of that project, then so be it.
Thank you, Patrick. We now go for a quick break. Join us on the other side for more discussions. Welcome back. You're watching InFocus. Still in the studio with me is Mr. Patrick Kaiku, lecturer of political science at the University of Papua New Guinea. Now, Patrick, a major aspect of PNG's relationship with other countries is the development aid it receives from developed countries. However, Prime Minister James Marape has advocated for the transitioning of such relationships to a stronger business and economic ties-based relationship. How can such relationships be best achieved?
Again, when we talk about our international engagement, the alignment to our own domestic developmental needs is supposed to be the major driving factor or major factor. What the Prime Minister is basically saying is that we need to start graduating out of this aid-dependent, When we talk about international relations and our foreign affairs, in most instances, it's always about accessing development assistance and aid from other countries. I think the thinking is, how do we graduate out of this to becoming more, economically focused and not necessarily thinking about what countries can do for us, rather what we can also domestically, do for our own developmental prospects. In national development blueprints, such as the PNG National Trade Policy of 2017 to 2032 and the PNG Development Strategic Plan and the Vision 2050, there are already policy suggestions about how PNG can diversify its economy, downstream processing, value adding, and if we connect our domestic development priorities with our international relationship, there is really no stopping us in terms of how we are going to graduate out of being aid dependent. We cannot be reinventing the wheel. We have developmental policies that are already on paper. It is the challenge of how our government agencies and ministries and departments are acting in an all-of-government approach to make sure that our international engagements facilitate our own developmental needs. So it's nothing new in terms of what the visions of the country is. The Prime Minister is just reiterating what is already commonplace policy understanding in all these national development blueprints that we currently have on paper.
Now, Patrick, we've recently seen the re-election of Donald Trump as the 47th U.S. president. Given his prior foreign policy stance of America first, which was somewhat perceived as isolationist, to what extent do you think this will affect the various security agreements signed under President Biden, like the Defense Cooperation Agreement and the Shipwriters Agreement?
I don't necessarily see the Trump's re-election as going to be to affect the DCA and the Shipwriters Agreement. The containment of China is high on the priority list of the American security and foreign policy establishment. The president may have his views, but if you look at the foreign policy making machinery of the United States, there are vested interests and different players and actors in the foreign policy machinery of the U.S. that may not support that idea of reneging on the DCA that Papua New Guinea and the United States signed up to. And it's actually been ratified, so it's actually on paper as something that has to be implemented. So it may not also be in the interest of the United States to renege on this particular agreement, because you're going to remove the American diplomatic footprint in Papua New Guinea. And the whole agenda of the Americans right now is to keep China out of this Asia Pacific. So it may work against them if they renege on this particular commitment to having this DCA and shipwriter agreement implemented.
Mr. Patrick Kaiku, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Malcolm Waira, and our audience members.
Well, viewers, that ends this episode of InFocus. Do join us again next week, Monday, on our regular time slot of 7 p.m. Till then, bye for now.
This program was proudly brought to you by Telecom Limited and Daytech.